Welcome. Today we will have another look at a game which I played against the German chess legend Robert Hübner. He was in the top 20 of the world for quite some time, I think almost 2 decades, and he was even in the third spot of the entire world at some point in time. So an extremely strong player. I played him in 2014, so definitely in this game he's a bit past his prime. But still, of course, he knows much more about chess than I do, and I was in for a very exciting game against him. He opened the game with the move e4, and I played my pet line, the Untitled Philidor with e takes d4. And in contrast to what we have seen in other games, where now my opponents played knight takes d4, Robert Hübner went for a line with queen takes d4. And now after knight f6, he even in this queen d4 sideline, he even didn't go for the main line, which is knight c3, bishop e7, and now bishop g5. But instead, he played the move bishop to f4. I think bishop to f4 is equally good as bishop g5, but it's just played a little bit less. So the advantage of bishop f4 is that sometimes white can go e5. On top, he can sometimes go h3, g4, and has maybe a stronger attack, and this bishop is not on the not hindering an attack on the half-open g file. And the downside of bishop f4 is a little bit that you put a little bit less pressure here on my pieces. So after bishop g5, sometimes there are knight d5 motives or something like this. So this is no longer in the position. It's a little bit slower, I would say. On top, after bishop f4, a line with knight to c6 is a bit stronger than in the bishop g5 line, but these are really opening subtleties, which I don't really want to go in this video. So he went back to d2, and after castles, we obtained the first critical position in which I made a mistake. So I was thinking for some time, and probably normal moves like bishop e6 or a6 are much better than what I did right now. Namely, I played the move bishop to g4. So it's quite instructive why this move is wrong, and he immediately punished me for this careless move by playing the move h3. Strong move. At very first glance, you might think, okay, he gets a double pawn, but actually this position is already significantly better for white. First off, he has the half-open g file, which he can use for attacking pretty soon. And secondly, his center is very strong, and he has the pair of bishops. So he has a lot of trumps in hand, and I don't really have any counterattack at this point. I went for a typical maneuver in the Philidor, which is knight e5, often followed by c6, and sometimes also followed by knight g6. As I attack on f3, he decided to protect the pawn, bishop e2, c6, and he played bishop e3. So this is one way of attacking, a logical way, bishop e3 followed by f4. Another way would maybe to go rook dg1 or rook hg1, or maybe even h4, h5 immediately, also just trying to attack. After bishop e3, the idea he has is that my typical reply, namely b5, that's also what happened in the game, is met by f4. And in this concrete position, I cannot play the move which I would like to play, and this is knight to c4, because you can just take, and queen d4. And now I'm losing just a pawn on c4. So therefore, f4 is pretty strong here, and this plan with bishop e3 f4 is pretty strong, because I can't go knight c4. I could go now knight g6 or knight d7. I decided for knight d7. And now it's clear that white is better here. Of course, now I'm threatening b4 and knight takes e4, so he just protected the e4 pawn with the bishop. And at the same time, maybe threatened e5, followed by bishop c6. So I had to protect with queen c7. And he went with the move knight to e2, very strong move. basically not even allowing me to get b4 in, and at the same time rerouting this knight via g3 to f5. And now this is really, really unpleasant for me to play, because I don't have that much counterplay, and his attack is coming, so I can see what he's going to do next, and this is just rook g1, knight g3, knight f5, and attack my king. So therefore I played some moves to at least get my king a little bit out of danger. King to h8. And yeah, this position is now a point where he played bishop to d4. Another move would have been knight f5 immediately. But yeah, he played bishop d4, and now I played the move rook to d8. This move's probably not the best one, because you can probably just go bishop c3, very hidden move. The idea of going bishop a5 maybe next. Yeah, didn't see that, and instead he played the much more human move, namely the move b3, which basically prepares a retreat of this bishop to b2. But after b3, I was pretty happy, to be honest, because I felt that my position was not as bad as it was before anymore. So I was, for instance, in a position like this, much more afraid that he would come with knight f5 and attack me immediately. And instead here after b3, maybe white is still better, probably white is still better, but at least I'm not getting mated on the spot. I went for c5, followed by c4 to get some counterplay. And he played another move, which basically waits a little bit, the move king to b1, runs out of the c-file, but also doesn't do something really immediately. So I felt he let me a bit off the hook right here. Played rook c8, threatening c3. So he has to go away with either the bishop or the queen. And in the game he played the move queen to d4. And during the game I wasn't really sure how I should judge a move like c3 in this position. So I was thinking, if I go c3, maybe he'll just go something like bishop c1. And it's pretty slow what I'm doing. I mean, I can go like a5, b4, a4, knight c5, a takes b, rook a8, and so on, but this is really, really slow. So I felt like this position is probably better for him. Therefore, I decided to keep it a bit more dynamic and played the move a5. Yeah, now most of his pieces are ideally placed, and he started the attack with knight f5. Threatening to take on d6, and I just protected with rook to e6. And here he played a move which I didn't see coming at all, and this was the move rook to g5. I think this is a very interesting move, because it's not necessarily the first square I would look at if I was to move the rook on g1, but it also eyes a potential attack, so either via the h-file or via the 5th rank. So this was a pretty strong move. I went on with a4, continuing my plan, and he played b4. So now at least I have provoked a slight weakening with b4, and I played the move c3. And now the structure that white has with this pawn on b4, which is a bit vulnerable, is of course much more favorable for me compared to a structure where he still has this pawn on b3. Bishop c1. I played g6, and now he went for the move knight to g3. And in this position, I somehow panicked a little bit, and I didn't see the best way to play, which would have been, and maybe you can pause the video and can try to find the best move for black actually, which would have been the move knight to e5, leading to a complete mess. One line could go f takes e, d takes e, and let's say queen d3. And now this rook is a bit on its own. So I could either try to directly attack it with a move like h6, which wins back in exchange, or, and this is very interesting what the computer gives, even bishop takes b4. This is not a move which I would have considered as a human, but it makes some sense, right? It's a bit slow, but you're preparing rook d6 and then really an attack against the white king. So therefore, probably after knight e5, he's not even supposed to take on e5, and the game could continue something like bishop to e2 and h6, and now some computerish lines like rook to g4, and if I take on g4, it's pretty dangerous with the h-file, and yeah, the game is just a complete mess. Even the computer doesn't know how to assess the position if you give it to him, so it's really, really complicated position. Instead of doing that, I went for a much worse option, namely the blunder bishop g7. And he found a very strong reply to that. I mean, now I'm threatening knight e4, so it's also pretty obvious reply. Move queen to d3. And now my plan was to combine this bishop g7 with knight to b6. And the general idea that black has here is to go knight c4 and then probably even knight d2. And then to open up this diagonal and try to mate the king. So for me, during the game, this looked like I have a little bit of counterplay, but the computer is not impressed. So the computer now gives a very precise line, which is winning for white. And the line goes rook takes b5, knight c4, and e5. Yeah, if he allows me to get knight e2 in, it's not as clear, but he doesn't have to. The line goes further with d takes e, and now very strong move, rook to c5, which is not easy to see because when you're calculating rook takes b5, you still have the rook on the other side of the pawn, and therefore it's not obvious that you come up with the move rook b5, c5, followed by this e5 deflection of the pawn on d6. The line still continues. I mean, obviously after queen b8, I'm just losing a piece, so therefore the computer tries to swindle even further with queen c5, b takes c, check, king a1, and knight d2. And even in this position, it's surprisingly easy for white to go wrong. And the strongest move, according to the computer, is the move a3. But yeah, even something like this, I mean, takes, which looks more natural. And the computer gives more amazing lines like rook b1 and e4 with the idea rook takes b8, knight g8. And the computer says that white is better in this line. Check, king b1, e takes d, c takes d, and okay, the line continues like this. And at the end, white is a pawn up. Yeah, but this is of course a very, very, very long line. To be honest, I have not even seen after rook b5, knight c4 that he can play this move e5. But yeah, of course, that would probably have been winning for him. Instead, he went for the move f5, which also looks decent at first glance, but he's not really threatening that much. And after rook e7, takes. Yeah, now if he goes for something similar, like rook b5, then I can just go knight c4, and all of these e5 motives are no longer in there. And now it's much, much nicer to play this position with black. I mean, you threaten knight d7, knight d5. At some point, you might go knight d2 check, and it's just horrible to play this position for white, even though you're material up here. So therefore, he decided, understandably, to just take on d6. But in this position, I could now take back, take, and go knight c4 again. And probably this position is still better for white, but I felt really happy in the game to get the position. Because now this rook is still boxed in, and it's not so easy for white to deal with that. Knight e5, and the rook can no longer move. And I'm threatening knight h7, which he cannot parry anymore. He went for bishop e2, knight h7, and here he played another mistake by taking on b5. It's better for him to take on e5, and then could get some line like this, takes, then maybe simple move like a3, protecting the b4 pawn and threatening to go bishop takes b5, when temporarily white is an exchange down, but his bishop is very active on e2, and his pawns are very well protected, and his king is no longer in any danger. So therefore, that's probably a bit better for him. Instead, he tried to sacrifice the exchange in another way, which was bishop takes b5. Now after takes, takes, I at least get this very important pawn on b4. Takes, bishop b3. And I played the defensive move, rook b7, which is probably not the strongest move in the position, but I still think that I'm better even after rook b7. He tried to reinforce his king a bit with bishop c1, knight c6. So now my goal is to get rid of this super strong bishop on b3, because then suddenly the king is also much more vulnerable than it looks right now. I mean, this bishop on b3 really keeps everything together. And time control was approaching, so I was happy to get knight a5 in and just snap off this bishop on b3. Takes, takes, and the dust has cleared. Time control was reached, and I had the time to look a bit deeper into the position. So from afar, I thought when I would reach this position, it should never be worse for me with this pawn on c3, but I was also not sure if it's really better for me. It turns out, though, that here I have a very, very strong sequence of moves. Maybe you can pause the video and you can try to find it yourself. And actually, that's what happened in the game as well. So I played the move rook to e7. He went f3, and now I could just go f5. Of course, he cannot take because the knight on e2 is unprotected. But after rook e3, I have a very, very nice move. Yeah, I hope you found it as well. It's the move f4. So why f4? Well, the weakness right now is the white king. And this is in particular because I got rid of this very strong bishop on b3. So suddenly the a file is open for me. That means if he takes on f4, I can now go rook a7 with a very, very simple idea of just going rook ca8 and mating him. And he can't really do anything against it other than giving up the bishop on c1. So for instance, one illustrative line would be knight e2, rook a8, knight c3, rook a1, king b2, and rook a2 mate. Therefore, after f4, he couldn't take on f4. He played rook d3, but this changes nothing because now I can just go rook a7. So maybe just to make it clear, in this position, if I go rook a7 immediately, then the problem is that he now has this move e5 still, and he can then protect by taking with a knight on c3. Whereas if I go f4 first, rook d3, rook a7, now he no longer has the move e5 without losing material, And yeah, that's what happened in the game. I'm just threatening rook ca8 and rook a1 mate. He played the move e5, but I just took on e5 and my opponent resigned. So yeah, obviously I'm threatening rook ca8 with a mate. The one thing he could try is bishop takes f4, but then I can just take back. And after knight f4, I again have rook ca8, rook c3, rook a1, king b2, and rook a2 with mate. So understandably, in this position, he didn't want to see that end and just threw in the towel. Yeah, of course, it was a great pleasure for me to play against such a legend, and even more satisfying, of course, to win. And fortunately, our team also won, and this was a pretty important team match against Godesberger in that season. And therefore, I was very happy to contribute to that as well. So thanks a lot for watching, and see you next time.
When you have stress, play chess. When you fall on your ass, play chess for a real deal, for Christian Seel.